Welcome to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast for farmers and ag professionals by the Iowa Farm Bureau, bringing you the news, experts, and educational insights that matter most. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to our February 13th edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I'm Andrew Wheeler, and this week's episode features three guests. First, we'll bring you Dan Halstrom. Dan's an Iowa native and the president and CEO of the U.S. Meat Export Federation, and he's going to offer us an update on pork and beef exports. Then, we'll bring on Dr. Ron Hanson and Amanda van Steenwyk to share their expert advice on farm succession planning. Let's start with Dan Halstrom, the head of USMEF. Spokesman reporter Corey Munson caught up with Dan at the National Cattle Industry Convention earlier this month.
Today I'm joined by Dan Halstrom, CEO and President of the U.S. Meat Export Federation. Thank you for joining me, Dan.
My pleasure, Corey.
Now, I want to take a moment just real quick to hit on pork exports. Exports were down overall in 2022, but at the end of the year, we did see some strength in those export numbers. Talk a little bit about kind of what's been driving that market.
Yeah, we were down actually quite big earlier in the year, mainly from a decrease in China. And of course, we were comparing to huge record numbers from the previous year. But oddly enough, the last half of 2022, China actually was gaining year on year, and that closed the gap. So they're going to finish up. Global exports for pork will finish up when we get the December stats next week. We think about 7 or 8% down. But still, it's the third largest year of exports ever, coming off of a couple of record years. So, I think in general, the broad-based growth in a lot of different markets is really the key on the pork side. You've got places like Korea, you got places like Colombia, Philippines, Vietnam. All of these places are showing incremental growth, and you're seeing an emerging middle class that's able to spend for quality. I think that's the theme that'll help us going forward as well. And the other thing I should note is that Japan was down a little bit as well on both pork and beef. A lot of that was exchange rate related. So think about this. Beef's got a record, pork's third largest ever, and that's with your largest market down slightly. So I think that bodes well because Japan will be back this coming year.
Well, that's a really good point, that pork is selling better now in the last, like you said, 3 years, 5 years, than it ever has in history.
Right, exactly right. And the disposable income in some of these emerging markets is increasing for food. And what do they do when they do that? They're wanting higher quality food. So they're wanting chilled pork versus frozen pork. They're wanting, programmed beef from the U.S., chilled grain-fed versus frozen, cheaper Brazilian beef, for example. We're seeing a lot of these trends in a lot of markets, so it bodes well going forward.
So looking at 2023, obviously says bodes well going forward, but any predictions that USMEF is kind of putting out there, any expectations?
Well, on beef, we're going to have a record year. We already have a record year through 11 months for 2022. We're going to be just under $12 billion in sales globally. Our forecast for 2023 is steady to just down slightly, only because of the expectation of lower production with the drought situation. But the theme's the same. Beef and pork, broad-based growth from many markets. So the diversification aspect of not just relying on a Japan or a Korea or a China, we're going to be disproportionately more focused as well on some of these emerging regions. Central America, South America, I already mentioned, Colombia, Peru, Chile. Indonesia on the beef side is another area we're focused on. And then Africa as a whole. We're not spending a lot of money there, but we do have more presence there. You can rest assured in the next 5 years, give or take, we'll be talking more and more about some of those countries in Africa.
And specifically, what kind of proteins are they looking for in Africa?
Well, they're looking for whatever they can get that's of value. So it's mainly variety meats, beef variety meats, and some pork variety meats today. But that's how it starts. And then the next step is to introduce some of the muscle cuts. Chuck rolls, shoulder clods, beef rounds would be another one, pork hams. So it may not be setting records tomorrow, but we're going to be talking about it more tomorrow.
So I know that we are seeing the reopening of China after a long COVID closure. but then that's also increasing infections of COVID around the country, and we're seeing a lot of folks getting sick from that. What's going on in China right now? What's the status?
Well, there's two things going on. Number one, the immediate situation is really dire. As we had predicted, if you suddenly open up everything like they did in December, you're going to have increased exposures and increased infections. So they've got a huge amount of infections. Their healthcare system's under some severe stress at the moment. But once the smoke clears, and it will, and things reach an equilibrium, there'll be some point in 2023 where the average Chinese consumer is going to want to get out more and be comfortable doing it. It's the same thing we saw in the U.S., the same thing we saw in Korea, Mexico, Latin America. We saw that a year ago where they got out and about. And we expect to see some tailwinds with increased demand, especially at food service in China the last half of this year. So that's what it's not all that hot right now, but in terms of demand, because of all the health concerns. But the second half of 2023 could be a much better story.
On the pork side specifically, ASF has been a big story in China over the last 5 years or so. Do you have any sense for what the status is of their herd currently?
Yeah, they've rebuilt their sow herd to a large degree in the last 2 years. But we do know they still have recurring outbreaks in specific regions. And it's not just ASF. They have outbreaks and issues with PRRS and PEDV and a lot of things. And this isn't new. This is it's normal to some extent. Now, ASF thing was not normal 2 years ago, but to have recurring outbreaks in specific areas is not that unusual. So that being said, the situation now is not good, but it will improve, and they're still going to need to import. They're not net exporters of pork, especially on certain things. Variety meats, they're not self-sufficient. Pork hams, for the most part, not self-sufficient. So there'll still be some opportunities there on the pork side as well.
Last question for you, specifically speaking about pork. As you look at those emerging markets, what are some bright spots that you see coming up in the next decade?
You have to start with Central America and South America. So Central America, you're looking at primarily Guatemala, Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador. Those are some really good markets for U.S. pork. And on the South American side, you really got to start with Colombia. That's the big one. You know, Colombia 10 years ago was a $20 million market. Today, $240 million market. So I wish I could order up 10 more Colombias, but it just doesn't work that way. But that's our goal. So Central America, South America, as I mentioned earlier, beef side, Indonesia, pork side, Philippines, Vietnam. These are all areas that they're no Korea or Japan, but they might be someday.
Thanks, Dan. It's always been important for us to keep a watchful eye on international meat production and trade opportunities, and that's especially true today. Next up, we have two experts to share their tips for effective farm succession planning, starting with Dr. Ron Hanson. Dr. Hanson is a professor emeritus at the University of Nebraska who's been a well-respected expert in the area of farm succession planning for years. Spokesman reporter Bob Bion sat down with Dr. Hanson at Iowa Farm Bureau's recent Young Farmer Conference.
I'm here with Dr. Ron Hanson, who just wrapped up a fantastic session on farm succession at the Farm Bureau Young Farmers Conference. I thought we'd start with this. What's the number one question you get from farm families about farm succession, and how do you answer them?
I think, Bob, the first question that I get many times when you talk about transition planning for farm ownership succession is, where do we start? How do we begin? It just seems like the whole idea of taking a family farm here in Iowa, passing it on within the family, and keeping those family members on that farm, just that thought process alone seems overwhelming. And I always tell parents, it's your farm, your family, your estate. What is it you want to accomplish? Most families do not have a long-term vision. You know, they go from year to year to crop year, but you need to have a long-term vision for the farm and the family and what you want to accomplish. And then once you do that, you've got to sit down as a family. The parents, it's their duty, their responsibility to sit down with all their children and talk about their plans and their wishes and get the input from the children, and then begin drafting out a plan to accomplish this. And that means that the family has to be open, they have to be truthful, they have to be honest, they have to be transparent, and share their feelings, emotions, expectations, and maybe even fears with the other family members. And then once you have that accomplished, then begin to put together a management team, their accountant, their ag lender, wealth management specialist, and then an attorney, because at some point in time, you're going to have to draw up the legal documents to make this happen and make sure everything is finalized. And Iowa Farm Bureau has a lot of resources for succession planning. I know you've got a center that provides these resources. I know there's programs across the state that Iowa Farm Bureau provides. And families need to take advantage of that and get there and talk with those people and make sure they get answers to their questions and their concerns. But most importantly, get started. It's never too early to begin the succession planning process. Most families wait till there's a crisis, a tragedy, and then what do we do now? So once you have a plan in place, you can always revise it, update it, tweak it, whatever, because situations, circumstances, people change, and you just always have to remember to expect the unexpected and have a plan to make sure our farm always stays in the family.
What concerns do you hear most from farm families?
When parents meet with me, many times I get questions that really underlie the fears they have. There are some producers, believe it or not, that have the fear of dying, that someday I'm going to die, someday I won't be on my farm or have my farm. The fear that if I turn over the management control, somebody might screw it up. Now there's financial losses, debts, all on my farm. And then if I let go of my farm and pass it on, what if some of the adult children would sell my farm? They just see the cash, what this farm is worth today. And those are fears, and you've got to work through that, because if you don't, those fears become roadblocks and no planning ever takes place. But my biggest personal concern that I see in farm families today, and I did not deal with this a generation ago, but I see it today in almost all the families that have problems, and that is greed and entitlement. And that is just simply because of what these farms today are now worth. A generation ago, the non-farming kids would tell the farming child, brother, sister, if you want to stay on the farm, farm with mom and dad, the work, the debt, the long hours, the stress, it's yours. You can have it. But now they're looking at what these farms are now worth, and I hear the comments in family discussions, do you know what the farm is worth, what we could sell it for? And that is just very unfortunate. I never used to see that in farm families, but when you get down to it, money, wealth, property, particularly land ownership, really puts family core values to the test. And what is most important? Is it keeping the farm in the family, giving the next generation an opportunity to come home and take over and keep that farm for future generations to make sure that our Iowa family farm legacy continues? What's it all about? What's the vision? Back to our purpose. I mean, our farm, our family will always be here. You'll never see a for sale sign on our farm. And that's a core value. And unfortunately, in some families, those core values are being put to the test.
What mistakes do you see most in farm succession planning? Maybe an example or two.
The number one mistake is that succession planning is not a priority. They don't see the importance or the urgency of it. The attitude is, we always have next year. We'll get to this someday. Yeah, it's important. We need to have a plan, but Have we done anything? No, we haven't. And that is probably the number one mistake that I see. Families just never get to it. And then I have some parents who have the attitude that the kids can figure it out. They don't want to deal with it. You know, the emotion, the stress, they just don't want to deal with it. And so the attitude is, we'll just let things be what they are, and we'll just keep farming, and I'll just keep my farm. And someday, when I'm no longer here, then the kids will have to take care of it. And there are some families where the children probably can come home and work it out and do what's fair to each other and be family. And then there's other families where it would just be a confrontation, and because then the bitterness and jealousies and all that stuff comes out in the open. So kicking the can down the road is never a solution, but I see a lot of families that do that. Yet you have to understand, 47% of individuals die without a simple family will. They do nothing. That's their solution. Do nothing. And, you know, you look across the fine state of Iowa and you see a lot of family farms, unfortunately, that have either been divided or split apart or sold, or in a lot of rural communities, farming communities. These are good, honest, hardworking farm folks, where some families don't speak to each other. Some family members don't like each other. And all of that could have been avoided with open communications, respecting the opinions of others, and having a plan. So when and if something happens, and it will, everyone knows what happens next, how things will be taken care of, who takes over, how do they take over. And most families just fail to get that accomplished.
Those family discussions on farm secession might not be the most comfortable conversations to have, but as you just heard from Dr. Hanson, they really are the foundation for a strong secession plan. If you need help initiating that farm secession process, Farm Bureau actually has a program to help you do it. For that, we'll bring in Amanda Van Steenwyk, who leads Iowa Farm Bureau's Take Root program. Take Root is a farm secession workshop series offered at various locations across the state, and it's free for Iowa Farm Bureau members and $55 per family for non-members. Through the series, Amanda has worked alongside hundreds of Iowa families that are dealing with the same farm secession opportunities and challenges that you might be discussing with your own family right now. So you'll want to listen in to what she has to say. Spokesman editor Tom Block takes it from here.
We're talking with Amanda Van Steenwyk, Iowa Farm Bureau's Farm Business Development Manager, about farm succession planning and Farm Bureau's popular Take Root program. Amanda, can you provide some background on the Take Root program and how it helps farmers start the conversation regarding succession planning?
Yeah, so our Take Root program, it really centers around getting your families on the same page and having that conversation about what your goals are, what you see for the future, what that next generation wants to do, or how they want to be involved in the farm. So it really is about that initial goal setting process. So what it is you want to happen and how you shape the conversations around what it is you want to happen. It is 2 evenings. We have a dinner and then we go right into the programming, and we're there for 3 hours, and we dig deep. We give a lot of information about succession planning and estate planning as well.
Why is this an important issue for farmers to consider?
Succession planning is important for our Iowa farmers just because it really is that next step in your business. And we know that our Iowa farmers are aging and our landowners are aging, and it's really important to have the plan in place before things actually happen, before life happens. Really want you to decide what happens on that farm. So you have to be proactive in that planning if you truly want your goals to be met through this process. And it was brought to our attention back when the Take Root program started by our young farmers saying, hey, our family needs more education, needs more resources in farm succession area.
Now, we know every farm is different and will have its own unique challenges, but what are some of the most common questions you hear as you go through these sessions with farmers?
Some of the most common questions we get are, how do I get my family to talk about their goals? How do I get my family to even start the conversation about farm succession planning? Because it's an emotional process. There's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that have went into everybody's operations, and that's a very emotional conversation. And then when you have farming errors and non-farming errors, it is quite the challenge to really think through how families are going to do that fair versus equal. So the common question is, how is it we start the conversation? Because there is no vanilla plan, a blanket plan for family farms. Because like you said, all farms are different, all families are different. So it's that initial, like, how do we get started? And of course, there's always the legal questions of the wills versus the trust and all that stuff that we have our attorneys there to address those questions too.
Yeah, and the questions are different for every family, and the solutions then would be different, as you say, for those legal aspects as well as the emotional or social aspects.
Yes, very much so. There's a huge dynamics within our families, and those dynamics can play into the resources that you use for legal tax reasons as well.
What are some of the biggest barriers that you've found to getting started in having these discussions?
You know, when we talk about barriers, it really is that communication piece within our family, because we can hire an attorney, we can hire tax professionals to sort out all those details, but getting somebody to facilitate and have the conversations within our family tends to be the biggest barrier, because those are hard conversations that you have to have, because you're talking about death, you're talking about money, you're talking about future goals, those kinds of things. And that truly is a hard conversation. That's not necessarily natural for many families. So that truly is the biggest barrier in the whole succession planning process, is that communication piece and getting everybody on the same page, because that really is asking that owner generation. And a lot of times that succession planning is led by the owner generation, but not always. But it really makes them take on a mentorship, a leadership role that maybe they haven't done before within their businesses. And also they have to relinquish a little bit of control as you go through the succession planning process. So that can be a little bit challenging as well.
What about just the importance of the communication between the generations, just so everybody is on the same page?
Yeah, that's a big piece of it. And that's where we start to encourage, setting those goals. And that's not just for the owner generation, it's also for those incoming generations to have goals, so that communication is open and that everybody can develop and move towards the same plan. And, sometimes we get a little nervous to talk about that because they don't want to be perceived as greedy, or they've got their eye on the monetary part of it. But really, it's everybody needs to be working towards the same goal, so that one can eventually retire. I know that's not the fun word that farmers like to say, but can eventually start to step away from the operation, and the other one can become more active. So those are things that you have to be able to plan for and have conversations around.
How about a timeline? When and how should discussions begin, and who do you get to help?
Yeah, so the timeline is going to look different for every family. Some folks have probably put this off for longer than they should have, and they need to start as soon as possible. And then some may have younger generations that are wanting to get involved into the farm, and maybe that just starts with bringing them in on the decision-making process or on what the financials look like. So it really is, the timeline is different for every family, but can't encourage families to be proactive in this conversation enough, because we truly want you to decide what happens on your farming operation. So it's really important to have those proactive conversations.
And you want to look for those experts, your lawyer, your financial planner, banker, who else?
Yeah, everybody's team is going to look a little bit different, but some of the cores for your team as you go through this is you need to have an attorney, a tax professional, and some families that maybe, I know we talked a lot about having conversations, and maybe that's hard for some families to have those professional, business-focused conversations. There are folks that can help facilitate those, a mediator that can help carry those conversations. So everybody's team is going to look a little bit different, but that's really the core that you may need to have.
I'm sure you're picking up on the theme of strong communication and goal setting that both Dr. Hanson and Amanda emphasized. And Farm Bureau's Take Root Workshop series can help make sure that you get started on the right foot. Those Take Root workshops fill up pretty quickly, so I definitely recommend keeping your eyes open for our next series of Take Root workshops, which will be made available for registration later this spring. For updates on our next Take Root workshop series, you can use the link in the notes for this podcast episode, or head out to iowafarmburo.com/takeroot. Another event we definitely encourage you to check out is an upcoming conference for farmers interested in diversifying their operations with niche crops and livestock, like meat goats, vegetables, honeybees, flowers, and more. If that kind of farm diversification sounds intriguing to you, you need to look into Iowa Farm Bureau's Acres of Opportunity Conference, which is March 11th in Ames. The event is free for Farm Bureau members and $55 for everyone else, and it actually sold out last year. So you don't want to wait around too long to make your decision. You can learn more about the Acres of Opportunity agenda and get registered by using the link in this episode's notes or by heading out to iowafarmbureau.com. That's all for this edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. We hope you found it useful and that you'll join us for our next one on February 27th. Thank you for doing the work that inspires everything we do here at the Iowa Farm Bureau. And thanks for listening to the Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcast episodes at iowafarmburo.com/podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews, and we welcome you to email us your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.